What should teachers be teaching our students about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and the current events in the Middle East? That's what we're going to talk about today on Freedom Friday. It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free. Good morning, friends and family. It's another episode of the Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you'll be freer after this hour with Sharif El-Mekki and me. Today we are discussing a very tough topic, which is what's going on in the Middle East right now, the current events with Israel and Palestine, the flame up nationally and internationally of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and a very kind of historic geography, a geography, a place in the United States that has, as in my entire life, I was about to say my entire adult life, but in my entire life has been one of those regions of the world where it's just rife with all kinds of history and contradictions and passions and I can remember all the way since I was a student in middle school wondering what was so unique about that part of the world. That it just was so different than everything else we studied. So today we're going to talk about it in the lens and in the frame that we always talk about these things. There are a lot of people on all sides of the fence that are getting very passionate, especially online, about whatever position they take about Palestine or about Israel, about
Everything has more
Palestinians or
passion
Israelis.
online, right?
Everything has more passions online. You know, you put it you put it online, and it's an accelerant to stupidity. I just have to say, from my own observation, I have never known how many people in my personal network have so many passions about this that go far beyond anything else that I've ever seen them be passionate about. So I have people that I consider to be the most mild-mannered people in my network who, when this particular topic started becoming newsworthy, man, boy, did it change kind of some of what I saw in their behavior and their attitudes. And to be very honest with you, it's a little bit scary that there's a part of the brain that shuts down at some point in otherwise reasonable, logical, peaceful people, um, that you see all the prejudice laid bare now. So it's unfortunate, but the way that we approach these things, Sharif, this is why it's such fun and such a blessing to have you and this Friday every week to be able to talk about things, is because we take a different lens. The lens is whatever you feel about the topic. Put that to the side for a moment and imagine that you have to teach a unit on this coming
Monday morning.
this coming Monday morning. So we call it the Monday problem. What will you do Monday if you're standing before students in a classroom? And that's the way we should approach all of these issues, because then it takes away a lot of the kind of the politics, your personal stuff, and the passion. And hopefully you're passionate about teaching, but you're not passionate about pushing your ideas on students. So let's start from that. First of all, let's start in a very obvious place, Sharif. You and I were just talking before we came online today. And though we like to think like educators, you're actually an educator. I'm an online agitator. But if we think like teachers about the particular topic, it still doesn't take away the sense of, oh man, this is a dangerous topic to even touch. Right? Like you and I both just said that. Like we are in preparing for this show to have a logical discussion. There was still this sense of like, man, this could be dangerous. Why is that? What is the rationale for why this is such a third rail of a topic for us to even talk about?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to, what you opened up with. People are impassioned about certain topics that impact whether they feel like it's close or far away. And for many people, it's not only close; it's germane to their existence. When you talk about like years and years of history, when that's also connected to any topic, and particularly like just painful history. Like, it's not just like history from after, oh, this is what happened. Like, there's so much history involved in this topic that's layered. There's also a lot of misinformation that's entangled with real history, talking about teach truth. There are things that, that occur that people have. Then you layer on top of that the historic commitment of some people for both anti-Semitism as well as uh, anti-Islamic, or Islamophobia, as people call it, but just bigotry itself. And so I think it's like those kind of things combined. And then you have the other layers of just like, some people are just uber patriotic. So whatever, government says, then that's what that's where they stand on. Other people have worldviews that's informed, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, this same thing, but here's my worldview, regardless of anything. I don't care about anything else. Here's my worldview. So it's all in one pot, it's all in one pot, and extremely difficult to untangle and speak about one without having that. So just the complexity of it in itself always doesn't always lend itself to rational conversation, and especially as you said, and it's online. So in 126 words, you're gonna have this opinion about some of the most complex matters of the past almost century.
Mm-hmm.
Good
I
luck.
mean, that's a lot. Yeah,
Yeah.
good luck with that. Here's a tough question. Do you think that if you are a teacher that teaches in a school that's majority Black versus a school that's majority white versus a school that is integrated and mixed, that you teach this lesson about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism in the Middle East differently, depending on those different populations, if you're a teacher in those different schools?
I think most people would. Um, and I think, some of it is like knowing the audience is the rationale that they would give as to why they're doing it. But I would push and challenge and just say, like, if you are teaching it from a teaching perspective, then why tailor it to the audience? Because you're supposed to actually just be teaching. At the end of the day, we want students to be critical thinkers.
Hmm. Hmm.
Why would you want a group of white students to be a different level of critical thinker than someone else? And it doesn't mean that you're not adding things, but like the things that you may add or push a challenge on, that should be still part of the bank, of and not approach even a classroom full of Black kids that it's a monolith,
Hmm.
right? Because even
Hmm.
that, and then I think there are other people who even have another layer of kind of variable that's in their calculus of how to approach topics, including this is, well, who's my administrator and where are they? Who are my colleagues and where are they? Who's in my union and what's their stance? Who's in the mid, right? Like, so there are a lot of things I imagine that most teachers are thinking about, to choose if they dive in, how they dive in, what resources they pull from, how they teach, who's in front of them, but also who's behind them, who's over their
Hmm.
shoulder,
Hmm.
who they go home to, but also who do they go next to, right? Like whose class are they going to next? Because I've had plenty of lessons where I'm gonna hear about it for the next teacher, like, yo, El Mekki, you had them kids riled up and they came to my class. It took me 10, 15 minutes to settle them back down. They were still debating, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, my bad. You know what I mean? I tried to like bring it back to a close, but like if they're feeling inflamed about or passionate about something, then it's not gonna stop because the bell rang. You know what I mean?
This is why people have unions, so they can stop teachers like you from doing stuff you don't need to be doing in your classroom with your with your young people.
Listen,
Um,
my union told me not to have lunch with my kids because the administration would expect everybody to do it. So, like listen,
this is why people have unions,
I,
Sharif. Um,
I'm
so
kind of hard headed.
I read an article this morning that is on this question: what should we teach young people about the topic today?
Mm,
Um, it was more clinical in what it was saying that we should teach. Number one, it was saying that we should teach about the geography, the location of the Middle East and its geographical features, talk about the countries and their interplay with each other, and do that from a fairly kind of, not kind of, from a straight up teaching educator perspective of There's a history to the region, there's a geography to it, there's a culture to it, whatever. Teach that part. Teach the historical context. So that means we can't talk about these things that are showing up in the news today as if they just happened today. And one of the ways that we're having the conversation nationally and internationally about what's going on in Palestine and Israel is we're talking about it as if it stems from something that happened on October 7th of this year, when in fact there's a historical context that would make everybody smarter, no matter what side you're on, if you understood the historical context. So of course, students, before they are asked to give an opinion or think about this, we should be teaching the historical context of that region. The cultural diversity. So there's a way in which that we have this conversation that starts to sound really monolithic about peoples, right?
Mhm.
And the deeper you dig in that region, and really honestly everywhere in the world, the deeper you dig into any of these stories, the more rich the understanding of the diversity of the people becomes. Man, just in preparing for this show, there's so much I didn't know when I started falling down little rabbit holes about which peoples are which over there.
Mhm.
We say Palestinians and we say Jews and we say Israelis and we say Muslims or whatnot. That doesn't even capture the diversity of the region. So maybe we should be teaching young people, giving them an understanding of what that means. There are societal aspects of this that I think are really important. I don't know that you could get all this in a lesson if you were teaching in a classroom, but the things about how culture and family and gender and culture, customs, how all that stuff plays into people's understandings of how they're interacting over there. I know as an American, looking at some of that, there are things going on with the way that they perceive the world that just definitely lets me know that I'm kind of ignorant of all their customs and kind of their beliefs and their religions and stuff that I should know more about. So I think my kids and students should, if we're going to have an intelligent debate or an intelligent conversation about these things, that's what the goal is. So my children should know more about the cultural norms and the customs. And then, I think there's something to be said about unpacking these contemporary issues. In my lifetime, this was done very poorly. So I think about some of the lessons that we had. I grew up in a time when these issues first started bubbling up for me in school. Iran was holding American hostages, right?
Mm, mm.
So at the time that American hostages were being held by Iran, what we were hearing in school about it, the conversations that we were having were very patriotic, but they weren't deeply contextual. They didn't offer a lot of background knowledge. They caused a lot more reactionary behavior in us than it did in kind of really teaching us. Now that I'm older and I look back on that time and I realize that there was so much to be said about what was going on with Jimmy Carter and then with Ronald Reagan and the transition and the backroom politics of it, the global politics, the geopolitics of it. How stupid was I? Like in what I was being taught and what we were being taught back then. I would hope we're not doing that now with this particular issue, is that we're teaching and talking about it in a way that ignores the fact that there's Raytheon and a military industrial complex that stands to gain a lot from this particular skirmish. There are, profit motives. There are, geopolitical motives. There are kind of nationalist motives that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when my kids look back on it, I don't want them saying what I just said about what was going on in Iran. So anyways, this article laid it out in these ways that I just said. These are the things that we should be talking about. It did, get into some other stuff, but man, Sharif, you teach and you've been in a class. You only have a certain amount of time. You can't cover everything. You got to give young people.
Some folks got 45 minutes, so before the bell rings, so you need enter, exit. So you're talking about 30 minutes.
Yeah, to teach all this,
35
right?
minutes, like it's, for the 45-minute class, but just, giving people perspective. And I would also push, like, you weren't stupid, you were a child. Like how would you as a child know about Muhammad Mossadegh, and
As
the
an adult, how
democracy?
could I know about that?
Yeah. Well, that was the coup that happened where he was removed, where it was like, when we talk about promoting democracy, and here was this, democratically elected. We see this often around the world where we talk democracy, but then when there's a democratic election that the people are saying this is what we want, and then we don't like it, our foreign affairs department or whatever says, oh, well, regime change needs to happen, that kind of thing. So that's one. And you were a child. I think as a teacher, one of the, back to, and I've shared this before, and I think it has even more meaning when it's complex issues like this. If we're really thinking about the aspect of critical thinking for children, want them to be able to not only decipher information but obtain information. Like how do you, we can start off a question. If you're getting all of these mixed messages, how do you even start to try to understand? Even that by itself is weeks of lesson. It's like a year-long theme, possibly depending on the class. Like, okay, if you're confused, how do you get unconfused or less confused? If you're ignorant about something, how do you try to understand? And one of the ways that we used to talk about this, as with my 8th graders, was whose voices, perspective, and experiences might be missing, or subdued, muted, and whose is centered and elevated. And that's for anything, just to kind of get a broader perspective, the importance of hearing different voices and understanding. And some people stumble with this because they do it clumsily or they don't think about it. So I've heard about people, like we're talking about enslavement, where they're saying, all right, you're going to be the plantation owners, and you're going to defend slavery, and where the kids are drawing from are just like not much. But how can you have them see, like, oh, here's a system that supports enslavement, and here are the reasons why, right? So people understand, like, oh, it's not just that person, it's also a system of how they were trying to accumulate wealth, land, power, at the expense. And then you start helping kids, like challenge, okay, when is it okay, when is it not, does it matter if it's by any means necessary, when does that come into play? All of these things, again, both historical, but also they're able to do it contemporarily. But I think the main part is like breaking things down, and it's one, recognize it's super complex, more complex than many topics that may come up, but then also not trying to do everything in 30 minutes. Because I can imagine some teachers just like, yep, I'm gonna give this like download. Nobody's thinking, nobody's processing. All they're really doing is rattling emotions of children. Like, you know what I mean? Which is just, that's also unethical. As from just a purely pedagogical framing. That's also critical. So I like the idea of like what you said. So I think there are like probably a couple of themes that would just continue to spread out, like the geography, the history, what are ways that people have resolved conflict and not. You start off with their own conflict, like how have you resolved conflict?
What might be different about this particular lesson that you would have to teach about this issue, you just mentioned slavery. Within slavery, that story as you teach it, it doesn't seem like there's a problem being able to say who's at fault, right, in that situation. So you're not trying to teach both sides of the Holocaust when you teach about the Holocaust. You're not trying to teach both sides of slavery when you teach about slavery. Maybe if you talk about something like, Japan, the war with Japan and Hiroshima, all that stuff, maybe it gets a little bit more murky. But it seems like this particular lesson that you would be teaching is rife with no clear bad guy, depending on who you are. And I'm putting all my feelings aside, because these type of discussions should not be about what I think. These types of discussions should be about what is empirically true, what can be discussed from a point of science, right? So that we get the passion, a lot of the passion out of it. But of course, I have my opinions, but let's pull aside. So when I pull those aside, this is a story. This would be a lesson unlike any others when it comes to being able to say that there's a clear right and wrong. There's a clear kind of moral distinction about where people are. um,
Mhm.
there it's more murky, right? And actually, if you're a teacher and you're having to teach about this, and you have a mixed classroom, this is why I asked you the question about if you have an all black classroom or an all white classroom or a mixed classroom, is how you teach this different? In a mixed classroom, you could offend one group or the other group or whatnot. Next thing you know, next week you're collecting phone calls from parents who
Hmm.
want to string you up from what you taught because you're not taking the position that they want you to take. So that's my roundabout circular way of just saying this is different because the idea that you could teach it so clearly with a good guy and a bad guy does not seem realistic. Do you think that's true?
I, I agree with you, and I would complicate a little bit more.
Oh, stop
Um,
it. Don't even. It's complicated enough.
let's take enslavement for example. I wouldn't just talk about like how people feel now. The what I would want students to analyze is how did people feel then. It's very easy in 2020, and I'm saying like 2020 hindsight, or 2020, 2023 year, to look back and say, yep, here it is. But what I'd want them to do and think about and read and analyze, because that's also, it's not immutable, right? Like those things can evolve, right? Like you got people now kind of erasing what Stephen Douglas said about, enslavement, what Robert E. Lee actually meant when he, you know, that the actual critical analysis is the primary sources of what were people saying then and what was the tension. Because when you think about the tension that was in America, where senators were getting smacked upside the head with a cane, and being maimed over this topic, that means it was pretty intense, and people had pretty opposing views. That's what I would want students to critically analyze. That's same thing with the Holocaust. Yes, the Holocaust itself, but I'd want them to analyze why were there some Americans who were supporting Germany, Nazi Germany.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I'd want them to, and those are the things that I'd want to go deeper because it's a whole lot of surface. So yes, Holocaust, absolutely. And why were people, when it's always like, oh, this is the right side, why were people who should have been on the right side on the wrong side? Why were they
Hmm.
turning a blind eye to what was happening across not Germany, yes, but across Europe? What was causing people to, agree with this, just absolute horrendous genocide of human beings, that was occurring? Why were
Um,
what I mean? So that's the stuff that I would dive into. Yes, like say, oh, now today, it's like apartheid. Like
yeah.
being able to show, like, hey, here, not too long ago, your parents, your grandparents were, this was around, and then quoting, and allow them to read primary sources. What did Ronald Reagan actually say about South Africa? What were others saying? What was the United Nations saying? What were these? You know what I mean? So like really having the history, but not just like where does everyone say now, besides the fringe crazies on the side? What were people who would call themselves decent, law-abiding, blah 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 citizens? What were they doing in that moment,
Hmm.
and how
Hmm.
are they talking about it at that point? Um, I think that's the depth of that. And again, you can't do it in a single class period.
No, you might extend this over, a year or a semester, but well, let me just so you just touch on something that I think is really important for me as a learner, a lifelong learner. So this summer I went to the Holocaust Museum and I went to the African American History Museum in DC. Went to
You see,
both on separate days. I think you and I have talked about this a little bit. And
yeah, I was
and
jealous.
both
I haven't been.
Oh, you gotta go to both.
Yeah.
It wasn't my first time at either, but it could take you multiple times of going to get the real kind of
Mhm.
you're confronted with so many questions. And one of the questions that I had with both the Holocaust Museum and the African American History Museum was thinking about the psychology of people who could watch something unfold that was like a catastrophe in terms of like an explosion of immoral behavior in their government and others that categorizes one group of people as not human to the point where general normal, just like normal people in society would walk along with it, right? Like, how would we ever become so psychotic and murderous that we would slowly watch the drip drop of a population being called less than human, and then a structure and a system start being created to exterminate them, right? And when I think about the slavery example, there was so much psychological stuff I was thinking when I was like, how are these people able to look in the mirror? I don't even, did they have mirrors back then? Damn, I don't, when was
Yes.
mirrors invented? Oh yeah, anyways,
Yeah,
okay, you say they
exactly.
did, all right, I don't even know.
Everybody didn't have them, but they were invented.
They were expensive. Um,
Yeah.
um, well, after the mirror, people figure out how ugly they were. Like, damn, that's me. Um, anyways, how could you go from being normal, just citizen, and slow walked by your leadership to eventually think some group of people are worthy of extermination? And I didn't get an answer from that, except for there's just evil in the world. There's just evil. Like there was no other way for me to explain it except for a metaphysical explanation of there is a spirit that can take over a people where they actually they will be okay with a group of people just being kind of exterminated and annihilated. So here's my long-winded way of going with that. I felt like that was a study by itself, like study that particular phenomenon that I just said, because then that would help me understand Rwanda, right? It would help me understand Yemen. It would help me understand Nepal. It would start helping me understand just genocide, period, rather than genocide in a specific story, because genocide has happened. I mean, it would definitely would help me understand the Native American story a lot better, right? Like, um, but imagine for a moment that you're a soldier or you're working for the United States Army, and you're being told that you have to make a whole group of people leave a geography and walk them in something called the Trail of Tears,
Mhm.
walk them and watch children perish, watch women perish. And when I say these words, it sounds like a story, but no, imagine yourself having to physically do it, right? Like, I love kids. I could never imagine being part of any group of people that snatch kids up and lead them to certain doom. That just, to me, I don't get it, and it doesn't work for me. But anyways, so my long way of saying, do you think that there's power in maybe not teaching about these specific stories, but teaching specifically about how genocides work, how they work everywhere, not just in this one story, but we're using words like apartheid and genocide, and those are two concepts that have happened all over the world, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly, what, I think the basis of, and again, back to critical thinking, this is what we should be talking about. If we want students to not necessarily be influenced by whether it's an ad to buy Coca-Cola or whether it's propaganda to get them to do XYZ, that's takes practice, it takes training, it takes one thing we used to do as eighth grade, we would read political cartoons. And we'd have to actually think about, okay, what does this mean? What are they trying to say? Who are they trying to say it about? Why would they publish this? What is the message? Is there a hidden message? Is there, like all of these things? These are eighth graders, but it was a because I wanted them to be able to be a to analyze no matter what was happening, and whether it's an image, and they're just like, that's just a image of just like, yeah, but let's look at like what are all the different ways that someone is trying to communicate something that they want you to think about or believe or reject or get, are they trying to draw it out of emotion, right? All of these things are part of, so whether it's students understanding, what propaganda is, people understanding, well, and again, back to that original thing, like what's conflict, when does it happen, how is it resolved, when is it not resolved? And if a kid
Yeah.
can understand it from person to person, they can start to think about how that is from people to people.
Mm. Well, look who arrived with us today.
Ish.
It is Ish, the actual teacher who teaches human beings, young people, in classrooms. Good to have you, Ish. Nice to have you come in and get your perspective. I was thinking about it this morning, and I saw your name pop up. in the comments, and I was like, I would love to know what Ish would think about how you're going to approach this if you have to teach this in classrooms. So,
Yeah.
and I know your background, so this is a particularly good question for me of how you think about your own beliefs, and then how you think about teaching this to a classroom full of kids who have to form their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, right there is just like the quintessential kind of contradiction or issue, quite frankly, right? Especially with a subject like this that is very sensitive, right? Regardless of where you fall in positioning, right? Or how you interpret the past. For me personally, I think you already kind of hit kind of like rough ground immediately when you have the discussion around displacement, around who should have land, access to land, who has claims to land, right? Because that is really the root foundation of this conversation, right? When we're talking about Israel's existence, right? Right after the British Mandate. So, like, the students would have to like understand that that land was basically handed over and it was supposed to be a two-state, right? A Palestinian state and a Jewish state, just right from jump. And I would have students look at those primary source documents. But already, right, it could be seen as controversial having that conversation about who has right to land, right, over periods of time, right? Because then we have conversations about do indigenous folks in the Americas have access, entitlement and demand to land, right? And will be able to be supported by foreign governments in order to make sure that they're able to maintain their government and get started, right? See, all these type of things, once you get into those guts and those hypotheticals, I would stay there and then move into just looking at primary source documents, showing clips of different news coverage, right? Because when we look at October 7th, and I think I heard this, you referenced this earlier, Chris, this didn't happen out the blue, right? This is generations, right, of folks who have feel like their voice has been denied. If you actually look at what Gazans have been doing, or Palestinians in Gaza have been doing, they've been trying to have a right to return march, right? They've had freedom rides almost. There's been nonviolent protests. There have been demands on government, international institutions like the United Nations, which has condemned Israel for creating basically an open air prison recently, right? When Hamas came into power, when the people voted them in, but the people voted them in because that represented something different than what has existed that produced the situation which they found themselves. And then Israel, right? So like once you get into those type of conversations, you're less telling them kind of your point of view, and you're more having a conversation about all the contradictory and overlapping influences and situations that have created the circumstances that currently exist. Now, if you create the circumstances correctly in your classroom to have those conversations just on a normal basis, that shouldn't be a controversial issue, right? You should be able to talk about sensitive issues without basically imposing your views on the other people or feeling that their experience should measure up to yours, right? Because you're really engaging in a dialogue about how we're interpreting the world. And if you really have created that situation and that kind of environment and culture within your classroom, these type of conversations, that's how I would approach it right away, right? Because it's less of having the students kind of believe something and more of having the students understand how they can get into the conversation.
That to me, that's a big part of the problem of having this discussion is I would imagine that most folks have not even come near anything controversial. Then they're going to jump in and act like they got a black belt and having sensitivity, sensitive conversations about sensitive and explosive topics as their first at bat. Like to me, that's like I don't want my kid in that class. You know what I mean? Like you have no business. You have no idea. Like you've not gone. The extent of your training was a book club or NPR or whatever news that you watch, and that's your training. Now you're like, all right, I'm ready to dive in. And I'm just like, it's not giving the respect to the humanity that's involved in all of this, right? Like we've lost the loss of life and other things. Like people should ask those who know. People should like try to understand how much they're ignorant about, how much they aren't aware of, and even if that's the basic of the start of the conversation, so I think, you know, who's having the conversations is even more important than what the conversation actually you know, is about.
So I'm going to disagree slightly. You're probably
Good.
right because you got all the book learning, but this is what I'm going to say. Slightly might be different. I do think it matters the content of what you're putting into the conversation, and the thing that I think is missing from my spiritual beliefs, that I think is important to the way we look at these is there is not an explicit studying of peace. There's not an explicit philosophy of peace that's interjected into this conversation. So when I said earlier that there are powers and principalities, there's just evil in the world. There's just things that people like. It's almost like people get intoxicated with something and then they're okay with doing uh, just terrible things to other human beings. On the flip side of that, though, there is a long study. There's a whole degree in peace and justice studies, right? Like there is a way of studying peace and how peace comes about. And there's not a bias towards peace in these discussions, in the lessons, in the conversations. There's a bias towards fault and blame and perpetuation of the same problem, right? Who's at fault? Who's to blame? And they deserve it, right? So any group of that's having something bad happen to them, there's not a bias or a prejudice for how do we resolve these things in peace. And then that would be the most complicated conversation at all, because I think Ish, you touched on some things like, you know, when we're talking about land and we're talking about resources and we're talking about who can be where and how they can be, that complicates your peace studies, right? That let's not act this is this would be easy, like, you know, to create peace there, but we actually have to study peace and how it works and where it has happened and where it has done well.
But that's my point. I think we're agreeing, but that's my whole point. If over half of teachers say they're not prepared to teach basic English,
Mm,
they're saying like, I'm not prepared to teach basic English.
yeah,
And then if
yeah,
you want me to teach
yeah.
basic English to a kid who doesn't look like me, then 70 something percent, almost
Mm,
3/4 of us, and I'm talking about like, you know, early career teachers, they're saying like, we're not prepared. So now we layer on, hey, here's a bombshell talk, right? Like, to me, that's the complexity of all, you know, of all of this. And then when we just look at like how many people actually understand history, and and again, not a historian, just a basic nascent level of history. You know,
mhm.
like how many people understand like Israel may not have ended up being Israel, because it was also talked about Israel could have been in East Africa. It could have been in
I heard
South
Congo
America.
somewhere else.
It
Yeah.
could have been
Yeah.
in New York City. It could have actually
Mhm.
been in Germany. There were a lot of conversations, right? So these are all the things that we should, you know, people should talk about, right? And then what does it mean when people like and asking, you know, because sometimes you got to have kids, no matter where they're thinking, actually have them also look at, you know what I mean, try to complicate the issue a little bit, right? So no matter where they're thinking, just like, okay, how far would you go if you knew that people were trying to they were sent your neighbors to you know, gas chambers, and here's the history of like trying to eradicate this group of people because of religious beliefs. What would, you know, what should happen, right? And then just like, well, how far would we go to protect? What would we think? Would trying to protect people also influence like what our policy, right? Like, and just helping them understand that angle. Then like, okay, now what about this? I love how you brought up like the Native American perspective. Like, okay, so if this is the right way, then that means in every land and space, is that the right way too? You know, is it, you know, are there nuanced culture thing, or is it like right is right? You know what I mean? And just is just.
So,
All of these
so
kind of things, you know, my students would normally leave without having an answer for a lot of
well,
stuff.
you
It
shouldn't
had
give them
them.
all the answers, though.
No. I'm saying they would. No, I'm not saying
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
I'm saying they in their thinking, what it caused them to do is like think deeper and deeper and deeper about, wow, okay, like, oh, I need to learn more about this. I need to learn, and not to say that they don't take position. No, they had positions, but they were also like, whoa, I have a position, and I have so much to think about at the same time.
I would love to, and Ish, I want to bring you in, but I would love to So we can transition in a second here to talk explicitly about Islamophobia, speak explicitly about anti-Semitism, and speak. We've already been speaking explicitly about the Middle East in the context that is not contextualized enough for the public. Like the discussion is really dumb on the Middle East, and I don't mean dumb in a bad way. I just mean like there's so much ignorance. People don't know so much that goes on there. I will float an idea first, though, which is I think that that people learn by being immersed into things. So there are people that go to Mexico to learn Spanish because they want to be immersed in it. There are programs that will send you to South America if you want to learn. I think actually to have these conversations, to be certified in having conversations, you should have to go live as a Gazan for a year. You should have to go live as an Israeli for a year. You know, immersion. I mean, there are people that do this anyways. They go to Israel on things like birthright trips and whatever to get more contextualized understanding, so they're not talking about something from a distance. I think the same thing should happen for Gaza and other parts of the world, because I think we're so spoiled. We're sitting up in air conditioning and talking about these things as if they're college courses, when in people's day-to-day life, when I look at the Gazans and I just put my own kid's face on the kids and the things that I'm seeing there, it's hard for me through a day without like feeling completely heartbroken. Like I think about, I empathize and put myself in that position. If I didn't do that, I could have this conversation totally different than we're having it right now, you know? Anyways, Ish, I want to bring you in and basically ask you kind of like, these are units that you would have to teach in your classroom. So let's start with Islamophobia.
And if you could also weave in the whole idea, like some people don't think you should teach empathy, which is tied to social emotional development. They don't think you should even teach empathy. So how do you even
Damn
approach
snowflakes? Teach kids to be snowflakes.
Yeah, you know.
Well, first I gotta say, like, research shows and everything shows like people learn better through emotion, right? Which is a good and a bad thing, right? But those things tend to resonate and sit with us more, right? So like some teachers, right, unfortunately resort to like that shock, right, by showing like, you know, folks getting extrajudicial murdered on, you know, several times in the classroom to rile up the kids, right? Which is real, which builds, and they don't forget that, right? But at the same time, when we're talking about something like this, when you're doing that, are you going to be showing, you know, bombing, right? All you really got to do is show the border changing over generations, right? To see what original agreements and what conversations were happening over time. Sure, you can find from Palestinian leaders throughout time and also from Israeli leaders, kind of dehumanizing language about the other side. And then get into the conversation, because like when you're steeped into something as you know, so hard hitting and so conflictful as this issue, right? The land issue in Israel and Palestine, you start to get into those type of conversations where it's like, how do we actually even move forward? Is there more than one side? Is there more than two sides? Is there more, you know, because you have to address the fact that there's Israelis in Israel protesting this right now, right? Or there's a large amount of Jewish people in America who are getting arrested protesting what's happening in Gaza right now, right? So you have to recognize kind of that human endeavor, also the solidarity piece. Now, that also extends right into that Islamophobia and even anti-Semitism. When we're talking about all these issues and we're looking at the world, we should emphasize, or we need to emphasize, the humanity of it all, and how people and these decisions happen as a consequence of human decisions. But at the same time, people are people, right? That there's people all over the place that you could point out and hold up as examples of combating and really remaining sane as the rest of the situation goes insane, if you know what I'm saying. And I think, Sharif, you were talking about this earlier. What those normal folks doing, right? Show those interviews with those Gazans, right? On Democracy Now! Has tons of those where they're showing the actual footage of folks expressing their frustration. That journalist whose whole family was killed, bombed, show his interview or show the clip, describe the situation, then show his clip of him leading a news broadcast a couple hours afterwards, right? That's the level. And then talk about what you would do. How would you handle a situation like that? And I think like all those situations from multiple angles, right? Even when you, like Sharif also mentioned about the Holocaust, when you're talking about all this builds empathy, right? This builds an understanding of the human condition, regardless of the side of position in which you hold, while at the same time recognizing kind of the larger context and geopolitical aspect that really, at the end of the day, does not really account to anything except for suffering for people on the ground.
Mm-hmm. That is such a deep point. This thing about, I said earlier, explicit study of peace, and now you just added a different word, like an explicit study of empathy and the ability to relate, put yourself in the position of others. I think that there needs to be explicit study around that too. I don't think that's just something that we could, that we can expect that comes naturally. I am watching right now lots of footage of dead babies and men crying at the top of rubble because they know their 4 or 5 or 6 children are underneath that rubble, and they are screaming out in agony and pain, calling the names of these kids. These kids are not. They did not deserve this. They're not terrorists. They are not. They are not. Their lives were not worthless. But there is a certain coldness and callousness that prevents people from seeing these exact same images that I'm seeing in this footage. You just mentioned the journalist who on air learns that his entire family has just been wiped out. If you are a person that has a family, if you are a man with children, if you're a woman with children, if you are a parent, there should be no way that you can see all of this footage of dead babies and brokenhearted children screaming out for their mothers that have been killed in bombings. People who thought that they were getting their families safe and into safe places, and now they are dead beneath rubble. There should be no way that you could hear the screams of the fathers that are looking for their kids, or the screams of the kids that are looking for their mothers, and not finding them, and have a cold response to that. If there's something, I would ask people to investigate. There's something wrong with you if you can watch those things and be completely desensitized to the agony and trauma and just kind of inhumane levels of pain that is inflicting on people who had no kind of the only reason that they're experiencing that is because they woke up in the wrong place at the wrong time that morning, not because they were deserving of death. And so empathy is something that I think we need to inject into the conversation when we see people being so cold, right? If you can look at Israeli people being gunned down at a festival and think to yourself, well, they somehow deserved it, right? There's something wrong with you. There's just something wrong with you. Imagine you having nothing to do with any of this stuff, being at a festival and being shot down, right? Or kidnapped. If there's something wrong with you, if you're okay with, the stuff that we saw during 9/11, right? That was being done by terrorist groups, but also being done to Muslim people who had no connection to any of that, right? So what I would call for in all of this is for people just to have a human contract with each other. There are just some things that we don't accept. We don't accept anywhere as humanists, as people that believe in humanity having like unsurpassable worth that you're given, that each person should be protected from some things that we can agree upon. Maybe that prevents us from making these things political, making these things tribal. And there should just be some overarching sense of empathy that transcends all these things when we see these stories. So that's my long-winded way of saying this. I know we wanted to get to Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and we've already been talking
like
about
that
the Middle
teacher
East.
trying to put everything in 30 minutes. Like,
right. Well, let me wrap up just by saying this, because I know we're getting closer to the end, and I would love you guys to chime in on those things. What I will say about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is that they are real, they are profound, they are empirically true. I'm not making it up. So right now, the White House is starting an initiative to reduce Islamophobia. And the response to that for some people that are Islamophobic is, well, that's not even a real thing. That doesn't even exist. I don't know why you should be studying that. No, it's a real thing. And it's a real thing that hits close to me because there's students in the school district in which I live that are Muslim students in the district that I live in that had a federal investigation. They were being treated so poorly by the staff, the teachers, students, and parents. And Sharif, you and I have talked about this before, down to boys chasing Muslim girls and rubbing bacon on their head that they brought from home to do this specific thing, right? I could keep going on and on with the feds had to investigate, but if you don't think that Islamophobia is real, it's always been real. 9/11 only increased it. And a lot of the legislation that came out of 9/11 intensified it and made it systemic, right? So, and then you get to a president who wants to have a Muslim ban, right? Not on terrorists, on specific whole group of people, right? Okay with that. If you don't think that anti-Semitism is real, listen, I've been studying the Aryan nation for years. I've been studying white supremacy for years. There are whole parts of the web that are dedicated to blaming Jews for everything that's bad in the world and inciting violence against them. If you don't think anti-Semitism is real, there's something wrong with you also. So that's my kind of, I'm going to wrap. I'm going to stop talking on that. I want you two to chime in on those two things, especially as educators, what you would teach about those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, starting off with the real part, and I actually would go a little bit back to like what you said, right before that, the study of being a human being, having students really kind of think about what is a human being, who is a human being, and then what do human beings deserve? What should be the freedom to, and then the freedom from? Like as a human being, I should have freedom, not just to do certain things. I should also have the freedom from certain things being inflicted upon me. And what are those things, right? And I love that humanity contract or something that you mentioned. I think that's an essence of, because and again, this is going back to, and somebody put in the in the chat, like this is like a multi-year, but it's like a commitment as an educational system of like, how do we make sure people don't become other? Because at the end of the day, that's the source of you call it evil, yes, and for tangible things for kids to connect with is like, when are people viewed as subhuman? When are they othered? And then historically, what has happened when people have been othered? What has happened? What continues to happen? Whether it's Germany, whether it's Japan, whether it's America, the Americas, like wherever it is, there are groups of people who've been othered. And once it's okay, and then how does it become okay? These are all things that I think are not just a class period, but these are an orientation and a commitment to help humanity advance to degrees that they haven't, because people will look at things and like, oh, there are less atrocities now than there were 100 years ago. And atrocity is atrocity. We're not saying like, oh, we want less of, we want the end of these type of atrocities. That's a very different, orientation, mindset, thought process, planning. And I think, unfortunately, there are too many people who are satisfied with less than, and it's okay if it's far from me. And I think that is how we generally approach it. Even now, when you see like, almost 70% of Americans actually want a ceasefire. And it has, probably almost 0 votes in our government. So what does that mean? And we're talking about like contract between people, the governed and the governors. Like, what does that actually, what does that mean? Well, and as far as like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, sorry, what were you saying?
Well, this last point that you're making here, when you say, what does that mean? That means that love is winning. It means that against the powers and principalities, the people still believe a ceasefire is the best way to go. They do believe that peace is the best way to go, even though their leaders are non-responsive, 100% non-responsive. If those numbers were different, if the majority of people were in a kill them mode, like kill them all mode or whatnot, I would be very worried about where we are. I'm still very worried, but I would be more worried. Ish, I want to bring you in on a very specific point. I forgot about asking you about this earlier, and I hate to do this at the end because this is introducing like a very provocative point that I think we should have touched on more, and it's my fault that we didn't. There are people within my network who feel betrayed by Black folks that they have supported. There are people that believe that they have supported Black issues through the post George Floyd stuff, the Black Lives Matter stuff, who are now saying, now when it's time for you to return the favor and be down with us, you're standing with. In their minds, they're saying that you're standing with terrorists. In our minds, I think that there is a piece of information that the public doesn't know about. If you were to ask the question, why are the Palestinians and Black Americans connected in somehow, I think most Americans wouldn't know the answer to that question. Like, what is the relationship there? Can you talk a little bit on that part of like why Black Americans would be so supportive of the Palestinians and see empathy for the Palestinians in this war, I guess we would call it. But can you explain that a little bit for the people that don't understand the connection between Black Americans really supporting Palestinians intently? What would you say?
Well, first I gotta say, why do folks gotta be so transactional with their support, right? Reminds me what they said to King back in the day, right? And I'm sure they said it several times over to a bunch of folks, several different times. And you know, when I'm saying that, I'm saying like it always is that kind of like solidarity with the oppressed. And I think James Cone in his book, in the 1970s, I think 72, God of the Oppressed, he was a theologian, and he went, that really speaks to my own type of view about how I think about it, right? And so when we're talking about kind of how we're making sense of the world and how we're even kind of like showing what we care about and talking about and everything like that, how are we treating other people in that regard, right? And when folks see the treatment, right, of the Palestinians, when you see the fact, right, I watch Democracy Now! With my children every night at dinner. I know it's kind of depressing. If you watch Democracy Now!, you know what I'm saying. But watching it at the beginning of this year, literally there was like 2 or 3 Palestinian teenagers killed every single day. Mm-hmm. So like my children were already fully aware before October 7th, right, of the violence that is happening over there, right? And the violence that they saw was pretty much one-sided from their perspective, right? And so when we're talking about that kind of idea and everything, like we have to acknowledge that reality. And I think by default, Black people, based on their own intellectual traditions of radicalism, of combating oppression, of being in solidarity with other people, viewed of being oppressed too, right? I think that is very important to recognize that there's a long history and tradition of that. That is not unique to this situation. Now, the thing I do also want to caution, though, is how this is also used by the enemies of Black folks, right, to undermine kind of goals and everything. So like that transactional kind of response that you receive, right, that is an indication of saying, well, you people aren't really with us, even though we're with us by like, taking selfies of ourselves next to something. I don't know. But like the whole point is like we got to hold ourselves accountable in that regard. And so when Black people look at what's happening across the world and recognizing, whoa, wait a minute, like when I look at where them folks is living, right, compared to where those folks are living, oh, they can't walk around freely. There's only one port of entry that they have no control over. They only have 11 hours of electricity a day with rolling blackouts, right? Like all those type of conversations, like, well, who controls the spigot then, right? Where does the power reside? And ultimately, no matter where you're at, you got to recognize where the power really resides in that situation. And that's why I think by default, Black folks will go towards, even though Black folks are not a monolithic. But again, I caution, folks need to be careful about how other groups can manipulate Black people in order to pursue their own political gains at the detriment of Black people. So as long as that's not happening, I'm all about solidarity. It's when it becomes a transactional relationships, which too many other groups of folks engage in, it kind of leaves Black people out to hanging and drying at the end of the day. And I don't want to see that again based on a conflict that's halfway across the world.
I think that's so... Thank you for that, by the way. I think it's so telling right now of how we have to be able to do two things: have compassion for all sides, but not be bullied into positions that we don't want to take by people who think we owe it to them to take the position they want us to take, right? I do think that this is complicated. It's complex and it's complicated. And the more we try and act like complex things are simple, the more we get into this behavior of, well, I did this for you, and you should take my position on this particular thing. And what you just said could be a whole nother lesson. Like the solidarity, African Americans, because of the arc that we have had in the United States of succeeding with gaining rights against an empire in ways that oppress people in the world, have to actually marvel a little bit at, because we talk about civil rights movement and those things in a way that kind of is like a black and white photo. We don't talk about it in a way that's vibrant. And no, this was a struggle. This was like, there were strategies involved. There was planning, there was work, there was fighting, there was lots of stuff that that Black people should be considered heroes for making happen in this country. We are the conscience of the United States. And that means also then we have to be the conscience of the global oppressed. So anywhere else we see, we are the actual leader, I think, in some ways, with the exception of like Ethiopia. I would say we are the leader in kind of beating the empire in some ways, right? It doesn't feel that way. You see stuff like George Floyd and other things, and it reminds you that you're not done. But I think that that's the why you look at any story like the Palestinians in the world, if you're an African American, and you instantly side with the oppressed or the people that need more power than they have, or the people who are being overrun by someone else's power. You have a choice. You can either be with the power people, or you could be with the people that need the power, right? That's just my take on it. Sharif, I'll give you the last word since we wrap up here. What's your final word on all this? I need you to settle. I need you to settle this entire debate.
Well, good. I'm looking forward to disappointing you, because that's not going to happen. But what I would say is, at the end of the day, what does it mean to be a human being? And what's the history of us not treating each other as human beings? And I think the more we, when someone said history doesn't repeat itself where it rhymes. I don't know if Mark Twain or somebody said that, but there's a pattern, and there's a syncopation that continues, unfortunately, in the human reality. And I think if we don't do anything, or we don't learn anything, like what we're talking about now, our grandchildren will be talking about it, in the same patterns and similarities in other spaces, including our own, like where we are here in the States. But as you said, these things are real. Anti-Semitism is real, and Islamophobia, which I don't like that term either, but just bigotry in general is so real, and it is actually being fueled consistently. And like we either choose to take a stand, or we don't, and we wait to be entertained by something else until something else happens that we just can't ignore. But for the most time, 300 something days of the year, for the most part, we're ignoring it. These things are happening pretty consistently to other human beings that we share this planet with.
Well, that was depressing. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that for at the end. No, it was uplifting, and I think actually we came to a good point. You just reiterated the study of humanity and our human contract, and coming back to that constantly as people try and take us off track, to take us to, I know you guys resisted my word evil, but there are people that will try and distract us.
No, not resisted, but just, I think just making sure, like, kid, particularly in the age appropriateness, like, people understand, like, okay, evil, like, what is evil, right? Like, and really helping to critically, because there's some people who looked at, the British would say, Thomas Jefferson was evil. Americans like, yo, he's the greatest thing to that. And Black people are just like, yo, that's your hero.
Which right? Americans, Sharif would say?
Which Americans I'm talking about,
Not
just
all
like
of us.
There are other, no, that's what I'm saying. Then there are other Americans like, yo, that's your hero, right? And so that's three sides. But the reason why British didn't like Thomas Jefferson ain't why we don't like Thomas Jefferson.
Right. Right. Well, my
right?
grandmother was very good about this. She just called everything evil. So, like, just so you can
That's evil.
that way you can just say, like,
Just
listen,
hit
it's
it.
all
Yeah,
evil.
you
Yeah.
cover. It's all
Um,
covered.
Well, listen, I appreciate you, brothers, as always. Ish, I'm so happy that you were able to jump on and join. You have an open invitation. You know that this is your spot. You can come any Friday that you want to come. We want to hear from a perspective of someone that actually does have to think about the teaching. Like, how do we teach these things? And is thinking about it all the time. Sharif, it's always great to have you because you've got like such a stately way of thinking these things through. And it was interesting to think about. There's a topic out there that we could cover as a show that we had to think twice about. Like, we had to like really think about it or worry about it in some way, shape, or form. And this was that's what this show was, just so people know. And just because of that, that should let you know how important of a story this is to pay attention to, because it's those dangerous stories that require kind of rationality and background understanding, knowledge, some things that is severely lacking in most American debate. It's all those things that we should be able to lean on to cover any issue, any topic. So for all our friends and family watching this, please, if you enjoyed this or if you thought that there was use or value to it, please share it with friends, family, and others. If you haven't already, subscribe and like the show. Leave comments wherever you can. If you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you are, help us get the word out that we are having these kind of deep conversations on Fridays. I dropped into the comments a resource from the Peace and Justice Studies Association. If you Google that, you'll find it. You'll find a resource guide for how to teach or how to talk about the issues that are confronting us now from the Middle East. So I would suggest that we all do a job of being lifelong learners. We learn it for ourselves. And then as parents, we think of ways in which we can layer it into our parenting so that we teach our kids to be smart about the world that they live in. And my final word on all of this is that we do need to explicitly study peace, empathy, and we need to develop a broader human contract. We need to think bigger than our little thoughts that we're having about these skirmishes that will happen again. They've happened before, and they will keep happening until we think differently about the earth that we share and the humanity that we're a part of. As always,
something beyond the United Nations, because that crap ain't working.
See, Sharif likes to add things at the very end that just could create a whole nother show. I can start a whole other thing. But you are right, brother. You're right. Well, listen, friends, family, this has been another episode of Freedom Friday. And you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer after this hour with Ish, Sharif, and me. We'll see you next week, next time. As